Welcome to Dark Corner's Dracula Century, a celebration of the cinematic centenary of one of horror's, and indeed one of cinema's, most ubiquitous characters, Dracula. For 100 years he's been on our screens, ever changing in his appearance, yet the name remains. The name is marquee. So we're celebrating by looking back through some of the posters that have borne that name over the last 100 years. Not all of them, that would take days, and cards on the table, those of you who watched our 2019 Vladvent calendar have seen some of this before. But those caveats to one side, there's only one place to start: 100 years ago. Made in 1921, Austro-Hungarian film Dracula's Death is the earliest known film to bear the name of the Count, and its poster is one to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, the film itself is lost, so despite the title, we can't be sure that this is based on Bram Stoker's novel, and most accounts suggest that it's not, actually having more in common with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which was released the previous year. It's set in an asylum where one of the inmates claims to be Dracula and menaces a female inmate who doesn't know if he is real or not. It sounds really good, and the poster contributes to the interest in this film amongst horror fans. Obviously, it's a striking image, but it's also a prescient one. How many Dracula posters feature this colour scheme, or have comparable images of fangs, claws and staring eyes? Dracula posters start here, and this one sets the tone. Some hope remains we may get to see this film, as a copy is supposed to remain in a Hungarian archive, but whether or not it proves to be based on Bram Stoker really doesn't matter. This is where the Dracula century begins, and there's a certain rightness to the fact that it begins with a film that borrows the name and little else. It would definitely not be the last time that happened. The name is bigger than the story, and films featuring the name of Dracula are a stunningly diverse bunch. In 2017, a copy of this poster sold for the record-ripping sum of $525,800. But you could also have had this one, or this one in which Dracula is for some reason checking his watch. The tremendous diversity of these posters speaks to the fact that the studios didn't really know what they were selling. Screen horror in the US during the silent era was very thin on the ground and almost exclusively real world, nothing supernatural. In these posters, you can see designers feeling out the ground for what would become Universal's most profitable product. From the cartoony one that can't quite take itself seriously, to the one that almost overdoes the horror theme, showing Dracula's victims like flies trapped in his web. And of course, the super expensive image of total dominance. But my personal favourite is this one, partly because this magnetic image of Lugosi shows why he instantly made and broke the mould for how Dracula should look, but also because it has a horror concept all of its own. The layout is that of a romance. Look at that central couple. But the pose is anything but romantic. Look at those taut, possessive fingers on her throat. This is the quintessence of Dracula. Romantic, yet dangerous. Swooning women falling for the fatal allure of the hunter. While most would admit that Todd Browning's Dracula leaves something to be desired, few would deny that Bela Lugosi is mesmerizing in the central role. Hammer Horror's decision to make a new version 27 years later was a bold one, and no one could have guessed how it would come to define the career of the practically unknown actor in the central role.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house.
Lee's Dracula is a completely different animal to Lugosi's, and animal is the word. The posters differ too, and yet one seems an evolution from the other. Lugosi is pictured as a hunter. Lee seems more like a killer. Lugosi is seductive. Lee has gone one step further. This poster, and the massively scaled up version in London's Haymarket, marks the moment that Hammer found its trademark blend of blood and sex. Neither is on display in the image, and yet it screams both. The inference is more powerful than a graphic image could ever have been. This is the first X-certificate Dracula, and it wears that warning like a badge of honor. Dracula would never be the same again, nor would Hammer Horror, and of course nor would Christopher Lee, and this won't be the last time that we see him in this list. Dracula is the big name draw. Put Dracula in your film title and it immediately stands out. But not every film can be Dracula, so how do you use the name without telling the same story or without even using the character? Well, if you're as big a star as Dracula, then your dependents and hangers-on warrant a film of their own. Even your pets. Dracula's dog, also known as Zoltan, Hound of Dracula, would be a prime example of how the big man's name can be used to sell a film. This is basically the undead amazing journey, as a dog undertakes a long journey to find its master, but accompanied by a zombie stooge instead of a cat. Also, vampire puppy. It's proved a very popular Dark Corners review and has an undeniably arresting poster, as does Dracula's Fiancée, Jean Roland's willfully bizarre take with witches, nuns, a werewolf, and a baby-eating ogress. And what could almost be a sequel, Dracula's Widow, directed by Christopher Coppola, nephew of Francis Ford, and starring softcore legend Sylvia Christel as the late Count's wife who seeks vengeance against the Van Helsing family for her husband's death. If you put Brides of Dracula between those two, you'd make an interesting trilogy, but surely the most tangential of links to Dracula is Dracula's guest, who is at least Dracula's guest during the film and not just someone who stayed with him once. The film is also known as Bram Stoker's Dracula's Guest, which sounds like a weaseling and clumsily worded attempt to link it to Christopher Coppola's Uncle's film, but this is in fact based on Bram Stoker's short story Dracula's Guest, which is believed to be a deleted chapter from the original novel. Although the film is so loosely based on that story that the lead character is Stoker himself, so the title could be interpreted as Bram Stoker is Dracula's Guest. Either way, and despite its credentials, it's a truly awful film.
I'll send you back to hell!
I am Dracula's daughter.
With its atmospheric lighting,
That's better.
sly self-referencing humour,
Thank you, I never drink wine.
and subtle hints of lesbianism,
Finish your wine, it'll warm you.
there are some who would say Dracula's Daughter is the best film in Universal's Dracula franchise.
Dracula's daughter?
And yet it gets less attention because, however hypnotic Gloria Holden is in the central role,
I don't think I'll pose tonight.
she's no more Bela Lugosi than the wax dummy in the coffin at the start. More importantly, she's not Dracula, and in many ways that brand is more important than the film itself. It doesn't matter that this is a proper sequel, picking up where the first film left off, with Edward Van Sloan returning as Van Helsing.
His name was Count Dracula.
It will never get the credit it deserves. The poster, however, is Universal horror at its best. Fair enough, the tagline, "She gives you that weird feeling," is atrocious, but let's put that unfortunate misstep to one side and focus on the image. I called Gloria Holden hypnotic, and the poster more than backs that up. Her eyes dominate, seeming to hold these petty nobodies in the bottom right in thrall, all of them caught in the act of looking round, looking back, looking up, all wide-eyed, all caught by her stare, all mesmerised, just as you will be, ladies and gentlemen, if you come and see this film. It's no accident that while the other characters are painted naturalistically, Holden's Maria Zaleska is stylised and coloured green. She is inhuman, monstrous. She probably does give you that weird feeling. This doesn't necessarily reflect the character in the film, who tends more towards one of Universal's tragic monsters, but it sells the film. If ever you want a quick argument for why painted posters kick the ass of photoshopped ones, here it is.
Count Dracula, monarch of all vampires, is dead.
Opinion is divided on why Christopher Lee was absent from Hammer's second Dracula film, but fortunately for Hammer, Lee was not the star of Dracula, Peter Cushing was, and there is a school of thought that Brides of Dracula was a way to set up a series that followed Van Helsing rather than Dracula, in the same way that their Frankenstein series had followed the Doctor rather than the creature. Brides of Dracula is one of Hammer's most gorgeously photographed films, and the poster more than lives up to that. A line of white-clad virgins lead our eye from young vampire Baron Meinster on the left to the spectral apparition of Dracula on the right. At which point we have to acknowledge that this is also one of the least accurate posters Hammer produced. There's not this many women in the film, and Dracula doesn't appear. The poster seems closer in spirit to the original script, Disciple of Dracula, which would have seen Meinster try to assume the mantle of the Count and get smacked down by the ghostly Christopher Lee at the end. None of which happens in the film, but why waste a great image? Or indeed a good tagline, the most evil Dracula of them all. He's not in the movie. Even the title is style over accuracy. These women aren't brides of anyone, let alone Dracula. Again, not in the movie. But who cares when it looks this good? So often, especially in the films we review, a great poster means a bad movie. This is a great poster for a great movie. From 2012's Apostle of Dracula with its starkly arresting poster, to the less stark and more bonkers-looking Evil of Dracula, which gives the Count an alternative Japanese history, something of Dracula has always been a richly mined theme. The return of Dracula is a pretty obvious example and a massive letdown to anyone who has seen this tale of vampire identity theft. Not even the poster is sure of itself. This dead body just seems to have been crammed in because there was a space between the girl's backside and the title. Japanese film The Lake of Dracula is a less obvious choice. We can assume the Count uses it for more than boating, and I can't wait to find out what. And it boasts a pretty eye-catching poster. But when it comes to eye-catching, it's tough to beat Mexican film Empire of Dracula. There's so much to like here. The castle with bat signals around it that appears to be floating. The vampire girl opposite, caught in the act of removing her wig. Her two friends who have been hidden by the photo, which seems to have been added to prove this is a real movie and not a drawing your child was caught doing in class and now has to see a counsellor. Then there's the vampire himself and his victim, whose breasts have been so lovingly and carefully rendered that you almost don't notice her hands are different sizes and her neck is broader than her head. And the entire plot synopsis on IMDb is: a group of beautiful female vampires lure men to their estate so they can feed on their blood. Love it. Harder to love is Son of Dracula, featuring Ringo Starr and 7 hit songs that I'm sure we've all heard of.
Just like she did before.
Come the daylight is bringing me down. I can't live if living is without you.
Also features Frankenstein and, why wouldn't it, Merlin the Magician.
But there is something in his astrological chart not yet visible in the stars.
But of course, the first rock and roll Dracula is not the first film to use that title. Famously, Lon Chaney Jr. is the only person to have played Dracula, the Wolfman, the Frankenstein monster, and the Mummy for Universal. His father was actually asked to play Dracula in the original film, but his failing health made the point moot. Chaney makes for a solid, if somewhat stocky Dracula, who heads into America's deep south looking for fresh blood under an assumed name.
A certain Count Alucard is visiting a friend of mine. I happen to notice that the name spelled backward is Dracula.
Whether or not this is Dracula's son, some other descendant, or Dracula himself is never 100% clear and doesn't actually matter. It's just a way of moving the character out of the vague time period in which Universal films existed and placing him firmly in the present. The swamp setting that Universal would reuse for the Mummy's curse is also well used. As for the poster, I think both Chaney and the film deserved better. Like many Universal posters, it uses the strong diagonal to draw the eye, but the image as a whole lacks subtlety. The use of green is reminiscent of Dracula's daughter, but there it makes her seem otherworldly in a good way, while Chaney just looks like an alien. Classic Universal posters, like The Black Cat, make use of negative space, allowing our imaginations to fill in the blanks. By making everything too real and solid looking, this poster loses its edge of the supernatural. A particular shame in a film that makes great use of Dracula's ability to become as insubstantial as smoke.
In this way it can move unseen among its enemies, learn their plans, and be in a position to outwit them.
Count Dracula.
Christopher Lee's return to his signature role was a big deal, and the poster for Dracula Prince of Darkness shouts about it in strong primary colours. Red, yellow and green on a background of black, instantly grabbing you, saying so much with so little. In fact, if this poster has a flaw, it's that it's trying to do too much. Do we really need the green scenes from the movie? Surely the title and the face say it all. Unlike Universal, Hammer never really had a house style for their posters. Odd considering how visually distinctive the movies are. So they're a mixed bag, but this one absolutely nails it. Almost a decade had passed since Lee had last essayed his signature role, and much had changed for Hammer and in society. Things that had gone implied in the '58 original could now be shouted and sold directly to eager punters. There was no blood on the original poster, but here it drips down the paper. Below we see Barbara Shelley's cleavage bared for Dracula's bite, and to the right she is pinned down writhing to a table, while Andrew Keir as Father Shandor looms in the background preparing to stake her in one of the film's most memorable scenes. And yet it's Lee that dominates, his strong features delineated in yellow and black relief, striking in its iconic simplicity, reclaiming the character and his place in our nightmares. This bold, brazen composition is well deserved of the film itself, made quickly and cheaply, but a strong entry in the franchise. As I've made clear in previous Dark Corners videos, I am not a fan of Bram Stoker's Dracula, not least because I don't think it's Bram Stoker's anything. Where the poster is concerned, my feelings are less absolute. On the one hand, there's that central couple straight out of an 80s music video, and the tagline that highlights my major issue with the film. But it is framed in this fake stone archway made up of images from the film, most of them, it has to be said, beautiful women. And this I do like. I like the aesthetic. I like that it speaks to the Gothic setting and that it uses images from the movie to do it. I like how it addresses the movie's central theme, love never dies. Look at all these lifeless stone images and then compare them with the central couple. Love is life, even when you're undead. Also, and somewhat contrarily, I like that this seems to be Francis Ford Coppola's answer to people like me who expected a film called Bram Stoker's Dracula to be close to the book.
Welcome to my home.
It seems to say, yes, you could be very respectful, shoot it sentence for sentence as if the prose is set in stone, but I've set it free, I've given it life. If you don't like it, you can go back and read the book again, because that is set in stone. This is cinema. I still don't like the film. I may be reading too much into the poster, but it has a point. Dracula doesn't always have to be pure horror. There are many comedic takes, and You can understand why someone thought that Mel Brooks, a man who made Frankenstein hilarious, and Leslie Nielsen would be a slam dunk. It wasn't, and the poster kind of reveals why. It's silly, no problem there, so is Young Frankenstein, but Young Frankenstein never seems to know how silly it is. It plays straight-faced, as did Nielsen's greatest triumph, Airplane.
Can you fly this plane and land it?
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
But Dracula Dead and Loving It knows that it's silly and plays up to it. It's also hard to shake the feeling that while Young Frankenstein was made by people who loved those movies, even as they mercilessly lampooned them, Dracula Dead and Loving It was made by people who hated the film almost as much as I do, and it's surprisingly hard to spoof something you don't like. Just for the sake of comparison, there's enough there to let you know that it's a comedy, notably the monster wearing a top hat, but it's dramatic. It tells you that this is more than a joke. And as long as we're talking about it, if you liked Young Frankenstein, you'll love Old Dracula.
Drac is back.
Says so right on the poster. And look how much fun it's going to be. Dracula is cross-eyed, the vampire girl in the bikini is winking, there's a castle growing out of someone's head. Even the skeleton is wearing sunglasses, as if to say, it's all good. And there appears to be a scene from the undead Benny Hill at the bottom.
No more blood, sir? Hey, we must have drunk 3 village girls already.
How funny is it going to be? Even the girl getting bitten is laughing. I guess somebody should.
Back in Transylvania, they found a drink that's new. If someone wants to drink your health, they drink it out of you.
Dracula is a world traveller, and yet most of his films are English language because so is the novel. But there are a few films that take him out of that comfort zone, starting with Dracula in Istanbul. Kind of a nothing poster, which is a shame because it is interesting. This was made in 1953, pre-Hammer, which means it may have been made without worrying about the copyright held by Universal. It's the first film in which Dracula has the long fangs that we sort of assume he always had. It also features no crucifixes because it's made in Islamic Turkey. The story pretty much follows Stoker's novel, but Mina has somehow become an exotic dancer. Also sticking closely to the standard story but relocated is 1967's Dracula in Pakistan, the country's first X-rated horror and almost banned for vulgarity. Again, the poster is nothing special, although I do like the man in the pink suit that seems to prefigure disco, and that poor lost-looking bat alone in the middle. But the most memorable poster in the Dracula in subgenre has to be Lucio Fulci's Dracula in the Provinces. What the hell is going on there? Also known as Dracula in Brianza or Young Dracula, the plot follows the misadventures of a toothpaste manufacturer and is pretty dissimilar from any other Dracula film. But the poster distinguishes itself for obvious reasons, and yes, the buttock biting is plot relevant. There is also a straight-to-video 2008 film called Dracula in Canada, or Canucula, but we had to draw the line somewhere.
Count Dracula? Is that who you mean? Why do you not speak his name? Cannot harm you anymore.
Dracula Has Risen from the Grave was the fourth of Hammer's franchise, the third to feature Christopher Lee, and the first that the actor didn't really want to do but was coerced into by Hammerhead James Carreras. And that may be reflected in the poster, because while we can clearly recognise Lee in the images at the bottom, taken straight from the film, the main image looks nothing like him and may reflect uncertainty over whether or not the actor would return. In fact, this striking and angry portrayal of the Count is a self-portrait by Hammer's regular poster designer, Tom Chantrell, which has been adapted into Dracula. Look closely and you can see the overpainted fangs. What Chantrell was angry about, I have no idea, but the film is driven by Dracula's quest for vengeance after he is barred from his castle.
Who has done this thing?
The title at the top is painted to look like a slab of marble, giving the impression of Dracula beating on the underside of a sarcophagus lid. The blue background is an odd choice, and this poster has less red on it than perhaps any other Dracula poster, and certainly any other Hammer one, a company renowned for the vividness of its blood. But a neutral background does highlight a stark and oddly powerful image.
Now my revenge is complete.
Why have we made an exception for Blacula? Well, firstly, because it's an important film in Dracula history. The character was originally to be called Andrew Brown, but star William Marshall pushed for changes that led to Blacula becoming African Prince Mamuwalde with a strong historical backstory. It shows the flexibility of Bram Stoker's novel, that it's able to be pushed into new and relevant areas. To be honest, the film isn't great, and nor is the poster. The cartoon stake is bad and the splat of blood is worse, while the pictures below just highlight how rubbish every other vampire in the film looks. Fortunately, we had a second reason for including Blacula. The following year's Scream Blacula Scream may be no better as a film, but look at that poster. If you're being hypercritical, then some of the side images do look a little static and dull, but why waste time on them when you have that central image? A voodoo circle of candles scattered with bones, and from its centre a column of bright yellow fire. It doesn't look natural, and it's not meant to. This is a magical fire. From behind it we glimpse the figure of an apparently naked man breaking the circle, surely hinting at some dark rite. But most prominently, rising above the fire, but looking straight out at us, is Mamuwalde himself. I love this image. The lines of his face are etched strong and hard, but look at the cloak. It seems to fade at the edges, as if it is composed of shadows, and it's from the darkness of those shadows that the naked figure seems to emerge. It's a phenomenal picture, striking, composed, a wonderful colour palette, and a great sense of atmosphere. Christopher Lee's volatile, on-again, off-again, love-hate relationship with the character that made him famous is the stuff of legend. And much of our fascination with the Hammer Dracula films comes from our knowledge of it. How much of the intensity that he channeled into the role comes from his own anger at the fact he was still playing it? We'll never know. One thing we do know, that's Dracula. If the poster for the previous film, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, was lacking in the red stuff and featured a Dracula we didn't really recognise, this is back to basics. Blood, Dracula, and a screaming girl, who I don't actually recognise from the film, but who cares? Her presence is an unnecessary afterthought. Lee has never looked more the part of the terrifying blood-sucking monster. In fact, Taste the Blood of Dracula, at least in its early sections, is a more subtle movie than this suggests, but it's also Hammer's bloodiest outing. This is a sales pitch for a horror movie, which makes the choice of tagline all the more bizarre. Drink a pint of blood a day. For our younger and less British viewers, this is a reference to an ad by the National Milk Publicity Council, encouraging us all to drink a pint of milk a day. It's a joke.
Drink a pint of milk a day. Drink a pint of milk a day.
And I really don't know what they were thinking, because nothing about this poster or the finished film screams comedy. Blood of Dracula, which would have fitted equally well into our Of Dracula theme, is a 1957 film in which a teacher, mocked by sexist academics, proves herself by turning one of her students into a vampire using hypnosis, an amulet, and the awesome unlocked power of human potential. Sounds like a film we're going to be reviewing at some point. Looks like one too. But check out the poster. An image that seems to come straight from the front of a pulp novel, framed by blood splatter. Strong stuff for 1957, and certainly a more arresting image than that used for Blood of Dracula's Castle. Another one for the Dark Corner's to-do list, if only we could find a decent copy. Directed by Al Adamson, to whom we will return in this countdown. The plot is wafer thin, and not even John Carradine can enliven it, but the poster is a disappointment too. Look down the bottom. In colour. The cost of colour printing has turned what might have been an eye-catching one sheet with lots going on into a dirge you barely glance at. It lets itself down. If you want a good poster, go to an artist. Actually, what Andy Warhol contributed to Blood for Dracula beyond his name was as near to nothing as makes no odds. This was made on the heels of his Flesh for Frankenstein. Like that film, it stars Udo Kier. Unlike it, it's actually alright. It's bloody, very bloody, and trashy.
And we must as well start acting the part.
Very trashy, but it has a sense of humour. Albeit a bloody and trashy one, and plays almost like a bloody, trashy French farce. And the poster's good too. No messing about here, although you do have to ask, has the vampire chipped his teeth on that girl? If Christopher Lee had not really wanted to do his third and fourth Dracula films, then he did at least acknowledge their better points in his autobiography, while their follow-up he could only describe as truly feeble. Partly that was because Hammer's funding had fallen through and budgets were rock bottom when they returned to their most popular character, more because they needed the money than because anyone had a good idea for a film. Sadly, not even the poster can live up to the glories of the past. Why the hell is Dracula green? They did it to Lon Chaney Jr. in Son of Dracula and it didn't work then. Although, to be honest, that's the least of my concerns. It's these unrecognisable people in the background that really throw this one off. The one closest with all the hair is presumably Michael Gwynn's priest, shielding us from the nudity of Christopher Matthews' Paul, who's not even the male lead, and is making eyes at the disembodied head of Anushka Hempel, which is inexplicably peeping out from behind heroine Sarah. She is depicted in a completely different register to everyone else, looking nothing like actress Jenny Hanley, and doing even less than she's given to do in the film, which, trust me, is not much. I have stared at this for long minutes trying to decide what the artist wants me to read into this, and I've come to the conclusion that either it was a rush job or just anything to distract from green Dracula.
I'm going, and don't try to stop me. I just can't stand it here any longer.
Good evening. Pardon our intrusion at this hour, but we had a terrible accident and we need your help.
When we started doing Dark Corners, it was a steep learning curve as we discovered that the world of cult cinema was so much bigger than we had imagined. We reviewed Dracula's Great Love without knowing that its star, Paul Naschy, was one of the biggest horror stars in Spain at the time.
Anything wrong?
We've reviewed a few of his films since with an ever-increasing awareness of his legacy, which doesn't necessarily make Dracula's Great Love a better film, but doesn't really matter because the poster rocks. Fair play. I don't like the tagline, "She's the kind of girl you can sink your teeth into," and to be honest, I don't like the stylized depiction of the Count himself, which bears little to no relation to the suave Dracula as portrayed by Naschy.
If you can't sleep, maybe we could take a stroll in the garden. It's a beautiful night. And a full moon.
A walk in the moonlight. Don't you believe that's too romantic? You've convinced me.
but the atmosphere is wonderful. The fact that they haven't used a strong, bright red for the background gives it an almost unreal, dreamlike quality, as if we're glimpsing this macabre grave robbery through smoke, vaguely reminiscent of a Ralph Bakshi animation. The bats seem to be detaching themselves from the storm clouds, so you can't see how many there are, where they begin and the storm ends. And all this hazy atmosphere is offset by the starkly shocking image of the chained girl. Naschy's films are typically as tragic as they are horrific, and this image is all the more powerful when you ally it with the title. This is Dracula's great love? She does not look okay with it. It's not romantic or even sexy, it's an image of pain, and that reflects the film itself. Dracula and everyone around him suffers physically and mentally so he can win his great love. And I feel like the poster is asking, is it really worth it?
For the first time, love brings a finish to the life of Dracula.
I mean, here and now, this is London, this is the 20th century.
Dracula AD 1972 was a big change for Hammer, moving their most popular character into the present day, another thing the star wasn't wild about. But if the film isn't one of their best, feeling horribly dated, the poster is actually pretty timeless. It's notable that while the film is relentlessly of its era, there is little on the poster to tie it to the swinging 70s. The two girls in miniskirts are barely visible, and the clothing of the more prominent woman doesn't scream 70s. Or at least not as loudly as it screams, "There will be boobs." Two things I particularly like about this poster. Firstly, the central placement of the goblet of blood, which you don't really notice until you start to analyse it in detail, but which ties the whole composition together. Secondly, the fact that lead actress Stephanie Beacham is unrecognisable, while the artist has carefully rendered an astonishingly accurate Caroline Munro. And you can't ignore Lee's tortured face overseeing all of this, wearing an expression that I like to think is similar to the one he wore when he first saw the script. But this isn't the only Dracula film that advertises its period up front. Produced by Wes Craven and starring Gerard Butler, Dracula 2000 has one of the most boringly prosaic posters we've seen so far. But that's what you tend to get from movie posters this century. The film, propped up by an all-star cast, is not much better, as underwhelming as its advert.
For centuries, a secret has been buried beneath the streets of London.
Jumping ahead another 1,000 years, we find Dracula 3000. Again, sporting a cast of recognisable names in Caspar Van Dien, Erika Eleniak and Coolio, and boasting a much more arresting poster. This is Dracula in space, or Alien, as you can plainly see from the Giga-style poster and the tagline, "In space there is no daylight." Utterly meaningless and scientifically questionable.
The lord of an unholy empire and the captain of an unsuspecting crew begin a battle that will turn the heavens into hell.
As a film, it proves you cannot live on in-references alone.
Transylvania? Where the fuck is Transylvania?
Calling the spaceship Demeter and casting Udo Kier will not make up for the film being awful. Of all the great pairings of horror cinema, Dracula vs. Frankenstein is one of the most tempting, and it's unsurprising there are several films with this title. More surprising is that they don't really have it. Starting at the shallow end, we have Spanish film Monsters of Terror, and I call this the shallow end because despite the title it was given in most English-speaking territories, Dracula and Frankenstein don't actually meet. And why would they have to when you have Michael Rennie playing a body-snatching alien and Paul Naschy in his classic role as werewolf Waldemar Daninsky. The poster's good, you can't get away from that, but even here Dracula and Frankenstein have got two other monsters between them. Shifting in the right direction, we have Al Adamson's notorious Dracula vs. Frankenstein, featuring Lon Chaney Jr. in his last film role. In this one, Dracula and Frankenstein do meet, although you wouldn't exactly call it epic. It's right at the end of the film, and it feels tacked on, for the very good reason that it was tacked on to a film called Bloodseekers. Dracula and Frankenstein were not originally meant to appear, they were added sometime later, and so do not appear in half the movie. The poster looks designed to promote a wrestling match, but again, it's eye-catching. Inaccurate, but eye-catching. Finally, we reach Jess Franco's Dracula vs. Frankenstein, the only one of these three that was actually meant to have that title, although its English release title, Dracula Prisoner of Frankenstein, is arguably more accurate. I wish I had the time to tell you all the bizarre convolutions of a story that also includes a werewolf, and this film also features another classic star fallen on hard times, in this case Dennis Price, best known for the Ealing comedy Kind Hearts and Coronets. The poster, meanwhile, is the least of the three. It's colourful enough, but says nothing much. Dracula has had some memorable adversaries through the years: Van Helsing, Frankenstein, Billy the Kid. Yes, the most famous of the B-movie Dracula versuses pits the Count against his natural adversary, a Wild West outlaw. Directed by William Bodine, who directed his first movie in 1915 and is probably best known for Mary Pickford's Sparrows. Decent poster, John Carradine, and definitely the most ridiculous title we'll be looking at today. I don't even care what happens in the film or that the poster looks like it's a computer game. It's Bonnie and Clyde versus Dracula. Although, to be honest, it's probably better to think of it as Gangsters versus Dracula, because this ain't Bonnie and Clyde in any way. And we're not done yet. The poster looks like a graphic novel, but Killer Barbys vs. Dracula is Jess Franco's sequel to his own Vampire Killer Barbys, and is about real punk band Killer Barbys. Spelt differently because the film had to avoid copyright involving a certain doll, who fall foul of the Count after he's woken by their music. We also have Frackia vs. Dracula, an Italian comedy film in which the most evil vampire of all time is pitted against this guy. Also a sequel. But if there's one film from this lot you'd actually want to see, then it has to be Batman Fights Dracula. A Philippine film in which a mad scientist in ultra-ray sunglasses cures Dracula of his aversion to crosses by electrocuting him so he can set him on Batman, who has been upsetting his nefarious plans. Great poster too, action-packed, tells you what you're going to see, and begs the question, what the hell is the design on Batman's costume? Boy, I wish this one was more widely available. Nosferatu was very specifically not a Dracula film. What? You thought this was Dracula? No, 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 Your Honour. That would be copyright violation, and we wouldn't do that. Please don't burn our film. But the film was seized and destroyed, and we're very lucky it survived. While Dracula's Death was the first film that we know of to use the Dracula name, Nosferatu, despite its protestations to the contrary, was the first adaptation of Bram Stoker's story, and boy does it set the bar high. While it is specifically not a Dracula film, F.W. Murnau's 1922 masterpiece may also be the best Dracula film, hitting the tone of the novel even as it slices away the wider plot to focus in on the vampire itself, played in disconcertingly stylized fashion by Max Schreck. It may also have the best poster. Any of them. Take your pick. Designed by producer Albin Grau, each one is a masterpiece of expressionist design. They do the film credit, and I can't give higher praise than that. Inevitably, Christopher Lee has loomed large in this list, but so far we've only looked at his Hammer Draculas. He played the role 3 more times. Of them, One More Time is of course ineligible and Lee only appears very briefly, but here's the poster anyway. Then there's 1970's Count Dracula, Jess Franco's attempt to tell the story as it is in the book, and the poster reflects the film very well. Disappointing, isn't it? This is the film that Lee wanted to make, and God knows it's the film we wanted to see. Perhaps the greatest Dracula of them all, finally getting to tell the story as Bram Stoker wrote it. This should have been great, the horror event of the century, but it came out dry, drab, dull, and a bit of a vindication to all those adapters who said, the book's great, but on screen, something's got to give. As for the poster, the added bats and fangs feel like a final insult, forced attempts to give life to something depressingly lifeless. 6 years later, Lee made his final appearance in the role in Dracula and Son, or Dracula Father and Son, a French comedy for which the poster is very much like that of a French comedy. It has become a bit of a joke, the final nail in the coffin of Lee's relationship with the character, but to be honest, for what it is, I think it's pretty endearing. And if the character was being played by anyone other than Lee, we probably wouldn't mock it. Although, the more I look at it, the more it looks like Christopher Lee taking Tom Cruise to school. The relative heights are about right.
Oh, come on, sweetheart.
No.
It's been a while since we last visited Universal's Dracula, and that's partly because the franchise doesn't have that many entries, and one of them, 1944's House of Frankenstein, doesn't have Dracula in the title, making it ineligible for our list. In that film, John Carradine played Dracula, as he does in the sequel, House of Dracula, a film for which I have a soft spot, despite a pretty generic poster. Because it has an interesting plotline for Dracula, which unfortunately it does not follow through on. Carradine should really be the hero of this list. We've already encountered him playing Dracula in Dracula vs. Billy the Kid, and playing George the Butler in Al Adamson's Blood of Dracula's Castle.
What are you going to do to me?
Right now, I'm going to take a sample of your blood.
But that's not the end of the story. Carradine was back with Adamson for 1978's Dr. Dracula, staring out of the fantastically uninspired poster with an expression of, what the hell am I doing here? This is another Adamson hatchet job in which extra footage was shot and added to the already completed Lucifer's Women.
You must make her kill me, and then herself, at the moment of orgasm.
As in Blood of Dracula's Castle, Carradine is not playing the Count himself, but he was back in the fangs for Nocturna, Granddaughter of Dracula, a disco horror comedy also featuring Lily Munster herself, Yvonne De Carlo, as Jugulia Vane. Who doesn't want to see the film in which these hip young things boogie in the vaulted catacombs of Dracula's castle, in which a dance floor has been handily installed?
But Nocturna is out for blood, fresh, young blood.
The film is a little bit soft-core, and the plot involves Dracula's granddaughter discovering that she can turn mortals by dancing with them rather than biting them, which is a time saver, but look at the poster! In the background, you can even see Dracula himself throwing some shapes. And let's not ignore the tagline, from Transylvania to Manhattan, she'll get under your skin. I don't know whether to love it or hate it, but I damn well want to see it. Sporting the same outfit that he wore in House of Dracula, this was Carradine's last appearance as the Count, a role he played more times than the infinitely better known Bela Lugosi.
I don't even have my own fangs anymore.
Based on his autobiography and every interview he ever gave, it's impossible to underestimate how much Christopher Lee despised the satanic rites of Dracula, the last time he played the character for Hammer. But, as is often the case with Hammer films, it's much harder to dislike the poster. I don't like the bat-wing points on Dracula's shoulders, but that's a small quibble in a very well-composed image. Lee dominates, of course, but it's nice to see Cushing there as well, in a good Van Helsing pose, and This is the only time in the 9-part history of the Hammer Dracula franchise that they appear on the poster together. I know you're going to go back and check now, but it's true. The beautiful women wearing not very much are a constant of the genre, but having one sprawled across the word Dracula like an altar really works, as do the nods to the modern setting either side. But if I'm honest, what really makes this work for me is that unapologetic splash of green. It's almost as if we're looking through a tear in the poster, peering into some clandestine world beyond to glimpse these satanic rites. The Satanic Rites of Dracula was not Hammer's last Dracula film. Peter Cushing would return for The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, but the title doesn't contain that magic word, so it's not eligible for our list. And it's hard to be sorry about that. A Hammer Dracula without Christopher Lee, it's just not worth the price of a ticket.
My revenge has spread over centuries and has just begun!
You might have thought that we'd finished with the Universal films, but I guess there is one more. Dracula Untold. Boy, I wish it had stayed that way. A film so bad it didn't just kill off a rebooted franchise, but an entire cinematic universe. It sort of goes without saying that as a belated addition to Universal's horror canon, this is at best an insult. What's more surprising is that even as a film in isolation, it's really stunningly bad.
Sometimes the world doesn't need another hero. Sometimes what it needs is a monster.
A film so relentlessly awful that it feels as if mankind must have committed some terrible atrocity to have this unleashed upon them by a suddenly unmerciful God. There really is nothing good to say about the film. But, and it kind of burns me up to say it, the poster's not that bad as an image. But actually the poster shares some of the issues of the film, which, just to clarify, doesn't look good. So it is an arresting image, and we like the bats forming the cloak, but let's be honest, if I took away the sword and penciled in some pointy ears, this is Batman. Look at it. That's a hero shot. And that was a major issue with the reboot, that no one seemed certain if they were introducing a dark hero or showing how a good man became bad. Batman or Anakin Skywalker. I sort of feel as if they were hedging their bets, and it quite rightly bit them in the ass. So this is a poster that does reflect the movie, but it reflects the movie's uncertainty of what it wanted to be. Universal's problem, and I realise that I'm no longer talking specifically about the film, is that their attitude to the reboot has been, we've got these properties that we're not doing anything with. You tell us what you want and we will force them into it, so help us we will, regardless of how inappropriate and ill-fitting they are. So far in this list, we've looked at films linked by words and themes, but these are linked by being three of the oddest Dracula titles around and by being sex comedies. We start with 1969's Dracula the Dirty Old Man. Not a promising title and not a promising poster, which I suspect is more recent than the film because I doubt they had the budget for marketing. This is properly cheap, like we've messed up the sound so we'll do it in dub cheap.
Open. Now that I got my supper, didn't I like this? Oh boy, I'm going to take a little snooze.
As the poster suggests, this also includes a wolfman of sorts. He's also Dr. Jekyll.
I did good, huh, boss? Did good,
2 years later, we encounter Guess What Happened to Count Dracula? Well, he got a better poster designer, nice use of colour, and I like the cartoonish drawings. This began life as a hardcore gay porn entitled Dracula Really Does Suck, or Dracula and the Boys, then had a mass re-release as Guess What Happened to Count Dracula, with all the sex cut out. Which made the title pretty appropriate because without the sex scenes, it really was pretty unclear what had happened to Count Dracula. now going by the name Count Adrian and running a nightclub.
Guess what happened to Count Dracula is a supreme example of a top-notch motion picture thriller filmed in magnificent blood-dripping color.
We now move on to 1979 and Dracula blows his cool, pun intended. This is a German sex comedy set in Castle Van Screw, at least in the English edit. I'll be honest, I'm not sure this is the original poster, not least because it's in Italian, but I quite like the aesthetic. And based on the trailer, this pretty much covers the essentials of the plot, which I think can be summarised as some models arrive at Castle Dracula and disturb the Count by playing loud music and not wearing very many clothes. The end. I think what we've learnt today is that Dracula is a very flexible story, Bram Stoker is probably rolling over in his grave, and although there are a lot of Dracula films, our countdown is approaching the bottom of the barrel.
There's no sign of the popularity of Dracula waning. Some versions cleave close to the novel, others use it as a jumping-off point to go elsewhere. Many, like Dracula's death, take the name and nothing else. It's an astonishing legacy that has been built on good films and bad, on mediocre performances and career-defining ones, on acknowledged classics and those that divide fans. And long may it continue. I'm a purist. I would love to see someone make a great film based on the book, but I also can't wait to see how the character is reinterpreted next. They won't all be to my liking, but that doesn't matter. No single film can tarnish the Count's legacy. Dracula goes on, maybe for another 100 years. Thanks for watching. For a literary reinterpretation of Dracula, then check out my book, The Immortal Dracula. There's a link in the description below. What's your favourite Dracula film, and which one from this list do you now want to check out? Let us know in the comments below.